let's use Excel this time to do something useful rather than just make things look pretty. So I'm going to set up a preliminary table here. I have a tip rate and a tax rate. So, and then the cost of a mill. And what I want to do is build a table so that for a particular cost of a mill, I can calculate what the tax would be on a mill of that price, what the tip would be on a mill of that price, and then the total for the mill and the tax, the actual bill, and the mill tax, and including the tip, what we might actually pay in the end. So to do this, we need some formulas, and we'll go through this a couple of different ways, and you can see some advantages to different ways of doing things. What I'm going to do initially to get the tax, this is going to be a formula. All formulas begin with equal. And then what I want to do is take the cost of the mill times the tax rate. So I could put in 5 times the tax rate is 0.085. And that 0 is pretty important. I better leave that in there. And if I hit enter, I've calculated the tax on a $5 mill at 8.5%. Now that's all fine, but it only works for that one value. We'd like something a little more robust here. So instead what I want to type in is equal, and I want to do a cell reference to the cost of the mill, which in this case is the cell A8, so I can either click on A8 or I can type in the address. And then I want to multiply it by the tax rate, and I can either click on B4 or I could type in B4. Either way is fine. Now, because I took a currency format and multiplied it times a percent, it knows to format that tax rate as percents, and it's rounded to the nearest penny. Now the advantage of having this here as a formula is if I change one of these values, say I find out that the tax rate's not 8.5%, but it's 9%, if I change the 9%, this calculation here is automatically updated relative to this tax rate here. So these two cells here are going to be what I call parameters. They're going to affect the values in the table, and if I change these parameters, what's in the table will also update. Okay, let me undo that. Go back to our 8.5%. Now the tip rate equals the cost of the mill times the tip rate. And again, that gets calculated. And the mill and the tax will be a formula. So a couple ways we can do this. We can simply say it's the cost of the mill plus the tax, which is in cell B8, and I hit enter, and it totals that up, $5.43. Another way, if we're going to do some sums, is to use the sum formula in Excel. So again, formulas always begin with equal. If something's going wrong, that's the first thing to check. And if I type in the word sum, Excel will automatically come up with this stream here of possible functions that are programmed, and also mentions what these are. Sum square, the sum of the squares of the arguments. So the numbers are squared, then add up. Sum product, the sum of the products of corresponding ranges. And what we want is just sum, adds all the number and range of cells. So if I click on tab here, it'll grab sum and give me the formatting for using sum. So I've got a parenthesis here, and so I want to sum up this number and the tax and the tip, and then I can close that with a parenthesis, and it'll sum those three values together. Alternatively, I can do equals the sum, and just click and drag to select all those cells, and I get the sum. And a third way to do this is I can say the sum, the first value that I want to sum up, and then a colon, and then the last cell that I want to sum up. So if I use a comma, it will only do those specific cells that are listed in the list with commas separating the values. If I use a colon, it'll grab the whole range from beginning at one end to the other. Okay, and again, now that I've got this updated, say I don't want to tip at 15%, I want to tip at 20%. I can change that and the values in the table, the tip updated, and the total including the tip updated. All right. Problem with this table is it only works if the mill costs $5. Now I can't change that, so I can say, okay, $12 mill, everything updates. $25 mill, everything updates. But what might be useful here is a full table for a variety of values. Let me go back, change that to $5 again. And what I want to do is bring my table down and get some more values down here so that I can look up for various costs of the mill, all these different subtotals. Because I want this to be a large table, I'm going to use a split screen. So if you haven't used that before, we're going to go to the View tab up here and the split screen. Okay, so now, this may be a little hard to see here. What I have are two different sliders over here on the right. So I've got one up here, which slides the top window up and down. And then I've got another slider down here, which will move the bottom window down. So I can come over here and scroll down as far as I need to, but still see the top of the table. You're going to find this is very useful to be able to see the top and the bottom of a table when you've got a large table. Okay, so personally, I always find it kind of annoying to scroll down to a particular row. So what I like to do instead is click somewhere in the lower half of the screen and then jump down to whatever row. So I'm going to come up here to the address box in the upper corner here. I'm going to type in a cell reference, say A200, and hit enter. And the bottom half of my screen has now jumped down to that row, 200. Okay. Now, what I want to type in here is the cost of my next mill. So I have to decide on how big of steps I want to use, but what I want to do is take the cost of the mill at the beginning of the table and then add some sort of step to it. So maybe I want to add 25 cents. And then I've got a formula that I can click and drag down. And as I drag down, this formula actually changes as you look at the subsequent cells. So I have my original starting value here, 5. And then I have A8 plus 25 cents, A9 plus 25, A10 plus 25. So when I typed in A8 here originally, that's A8 is what we call a relative address, so that when I drag down, the value of the cell drags down. So it's always basically the cell above plus 25 cents. Now, if I try dragging down, it gets pretty tedious. So a nice trick here, I can click on the formula. I'm going to hold the Shift key down with my finger, and I'm going to click on row 200 here, and that will select all of those cells. And then I can press Control D to copy down. Let me undo that. So another way to do that would be under the Home menu, Fill, and Fill Down. Okay, now if I wanted to change the formula, say I wanted to make bigger steps, maybe I want to have increases of 50 cents. That only changed the original, the one formula. These are still plus 25 cents. So I'm going to click on this one, Shift click to select all those cells, Control D, and copy down. Now I'm going to get that little black plus in the corner of my screen, and I'm going to drag up a little bit. That way my table stops at $100, which looks nice. Okay, so we've got a table here, and we just need to copy some of our formulas down. But there's something that's going to happen. It's going to look a little odd at first. A little adjusting here on my screen. Okay. So if I grab this formula, it's cell A8 times cell B4. If I drag down a couple cells, I get some zeros, rather than the tax on a mill of $5.50 and the tax on a mill of 60 cents. And if I click on the cell here and come up here and look at the formula, what I've got there is equal A9 times B5. A9 is the cost of my next mill, $5.50, my table, times B5. B5 is an empty cell. So what I have here is $5.50 times 0, which is why I'm getting the 0 in my calculated field. What is happening, again, is the relative address. When I drag down, in my original formula, the A8 is being dragged down and being updated. So A8 becomes A9, A9 becomes A10. But at the same time, B4 also being dragged down becomes B5 and B6. And I don't want B4 to get dragged down. I don't want it to change. I want B4 to be a fixed address and A8 be a relative address. So to change that, I'm going to come up here to B4, click on it, and this will seem a little odd, but you're going to do this so often in this class that you're going to get very used to it. And notice in the top row of your keyboard, you have some function keys, F1, F2, F3, F4. And what I want to do is F4 the B4. So function 4. When I do that, I get some dollar signs. And what that does is it fixes that formula to stay at B and stay at 4. And so I'll have just B4 there. And when I drag this formula down now, I'm actually getting numbers. And if I click on the individual cells, you'll see I now have A9 times B4 and A10 times B4. So very important idea here, the difference between what we call absolute addresses and relative addresses. When those dollar signs are in there with the cell address, that fixes the cell address to be an absolute address, and it won't change if you drag down, drag right, drag up, drag left. If the dollar signs aren't in there, when you drag a formula that has a reference without the dollar signs, those formulas, those references to those cells will update depending on what direction we're dragging the formula. Okay, here's another nice shortcut. If the cell to the left of the column, if the column to the left of the column we want to complete is already completed, if we just get the little black plus in the corner and double click, it will complete the rest of the table without having to do the shift click and copy down. That one's pretty handy. Okay, so let's go to the tip here. And again, if we drag down as is, we get something that doesn't make sense. So we've got a dollar tip on a $5 mill, but only a 47-cent tip on a $5.50 mill, and no tip at all on the $6 mill. Again, when we drag down the original formula A8 times B3, it became A9 times B4. B4 is our tax rate, not our tip rate. And then the next row down, A10 times B5. A10 is the cost of the mill, but B5 is an empty cell. So what we need to do here in our formula is select the B3, click on F4 to put in those dollar signs, make the B3 a absolute address, and then we should be able to copy down and complete the rest of the table. So in general, if you have parameters that you're going to be referencing throughout a table, any reference in your table going back to those parameters, you're going to need those dollar signs. You're going to need to F4 those references. so that they update correctly. Okay, now going to our next two formulas. The mill and tax is A8 times B8, A8 being the cost of the mill, B8 being the cost of the tax. And neither of those need to be absolute references, so those we can just copy down. Same thing with the mill tax and tip. They're just referring back to these values in the table. They're not going back to our two parameters. And so we can actually click here and then shift click down here, select both of those columns at the same time, Control D, and complete both columns. One last thing I want to show you that's kind of handy, especially when you're working with a lot of formulas in a table, is over on the left side of your keyboard, you'll probably see a Control CTRL key at the bottom, and towards the top a tilde key. And what does tilde look like? Tilde looks like that. What I want you to do, press down the Control key, then type the tilde key. And what it will do is toggle your table, so rather than displaying numbers, it displays formulas. Control tilde again, and it toggles back to displaying the numerical values. Control tilde displays the formulas. So this is pretty handy when you're looking at a lot of tables, trying to figure out why something is working, why something's not working, and I think you'll find that useful.